The autumn sun was setting over Arlington, Virginia, casting long shadows across the tree-lined streets of this usually peaceful suburb. Two teenagers were driving home from their weekly volunteer session at First Community Church, where they'd spent the afternoon helping organize a food drive for the local homeless shelter. The brother and sister duo, children of a prominent U.S. senator, were discussing their plans for the upcoming school week when they noticed the flashing lights in their rearview mirror. "That's weird," the older brother said, carefully signaling and pulling their silver Mercedes SUV to the side of the road. His sister lowered the volume of the worship music they'd been listening to, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. Something about the situation made her uneasy, despite knowing they'd done nothing wrong. The police cruiser parked behind them, its lights still flashing, drawing the attention of curious neighbors who peered through their windows. Two officers emerged, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but carrying himself with an air of authority that seemed somehow forced. The taller officer approached the driver's side window, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. "License, registration, and insurance," he demanded, skipping any greeting. His nameplate read Officer T, and his tone carried none of the professional courtesy one might expect. The young driver, maintaining his composure, reached slowly for his wallet. "May I ask why we're being pulled over, sir?" "I don't think I was speeding or breaking any traffic laws." "Your vehicle matches the description of one involved in a drug trafficking case," Officer T replied curtly, his eyes scanning the car's interior with unusual intensity. "Where are you kids coming from?" "We're just heading home from church," the sister spoke up, her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. "We were volunteering at the food drive. You can call the organizers to verify." "Step out of the vehicle," the second officer interrupted, suddenly appearing at the passenger side window. His badge identified him as Officer C. "Both of you." The siblings exchanged worried glances. Their father, the senator, had taught them how to handle police interactions: stay calm, be respectful, but know their rights. "Sir," the brother began, "I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to call our father first. He's a U.S. Sen." "I said step out." Officer T's voice rose sharply, his hand tightening on his holster. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The teenagers slowly exited the vehicle, the sister's hands shaking as she clutched her phone. The autumn wind whipped around them as more neighbors gathered on their porches, some already recording with their phones. Something about this stop felt increasingly wrong. "We have reason to believe," Officer C announced, pulling on latex gloves, "that this vehicle was used to transport illegal substances earlier today." He moved toward the SUV's trunk. "We're going to conduct a search." "Don't we have rights?" the sister asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you need a warrant or probable cause?" Officer T stepped closer, his badge catching the fading sunlight. "Anonymous tip is all the probable cause we need. Now stand aside and keep quiet." As the officers began their search, neither teenager noticed the quick glance the two policemen exchanged, a look that would later become crucial evidence in understanding what was really happening on that quiet Sunday afternoon. The sister managed to send a quick text before Officer C ordered her to put her phone away. "Dad, something's wrong. Police stopping us on Oak Street. Please come." The autumn breeze carried the sound of more sirens in the distance, but these were heading away from the scene, oblivious to the grave injustice unfolding in this peaceful neighborhood. What started as a simple traffic stop was about to expose a scandal that would rock the entire police department and change the lives of everyone involved. Little did these officers know, their routine harassment of seemingly privileged teenagers would unravel a web of corruption that had been growing unchecked for years within the department. As the sun continued to set, casting an eerily beautiful orange glow across the scene, none of the participants realized they were about to become part of one of the most significant police corruption cases in recent history. The situation at the roadside quickly spiraled from concerning to alarming. As the two teenagers stood shivering in the autumn wind, Officer T began questioning them with an intensity that seemed out of proportion for a routine traffic stop. His partner, Officer C, circled their Mercedes SUV like a predator sizing up its prey. "How long have you owned this vehicle?" Officer T demanded, his flashlight beam dancing across their faces despite the remaining daylight. The brother, trying to maintain his composure, explained that it was their father's car, which they used for volunteer work and school activities. "Convenient story," Officer C sneered, running his gloved hand along the car's pristine silver paint. Rich kids doing volunteer work. Never heard that one before. The air quotes he made around the words volunteer work dripped with sarcasm. The sister, still clutching her phone, spoke up. We have pictures from today's food drive. The church coordinator can verify everything. Please just let me show you. Hand over the phone. Officer T interrupted, extending his hand. Both of you. We can't have you deleting evidence. Evidence of what? The brother asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. We've done nothing wrong. This is harassment, and our father. Oh yes, the important father, Officer C cut in, stepping uncomfortably close. We've heard it all before. Hand over the phones, or we'll consider this resisting. More neighbors had gathered now, their presence both reassuring and somehow adding to the tension. Mrs. P from next door, who had known the teens since they were small, stepped off her porch and approached slowly, her garden shears still in hand from pruning her roses. Officers, she called out, her grandmother's instinct to protect overriding her usual caution around law enforcement. These are good kids. I've known them for years. They really do volunteer. Ma'am, return to your property immediately. Officer T barked, his hand again moving to his holster in a gesture that seemed more threatening than professional. This is a police investigation. The sister's hands trembled as she unlocked her phone. Just before handing it over, she managed to press send on a second message to their father. They're taking our phones. Please hurry. Officer C snatched both devices, carelessly dropping them into his pocket. The brother noticed him switch off the sister's phone, a detail that would later prove significant in the investigation. Now, Officer T announced, pulling out a pair of disposable gloves with theatrical slowness, we're going to do a thorough search of the vehicle. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about. The irony of his words hung heavy in the air. The growing crowd of neighbors had their own phones out now, recording the scene from a safe distance. The officers seemed unbothered by the audience, another detail that would later raise red flags among investigators. As Officer C began roughly pulling items from the trunk, tossing aside the carefully organized donation receipts and church pro grana materials, the sister whispered to her brother, "They're not even logging what they're touching. Dad says that's against procedure." "Keep your mouth shut," Officer T snapped, though he stood far enough away that he shouldn't have heard her whisper. His heightened reaction to their every movement suggested something more than routine police work was at play. The sun had almost completely set now, and the police cruiser's flashing lights created an otherworldly atmosphere on the peaceful suburban street. The officers' aggressive behavior seemed to intensify with the growing darkness, as if they were racing against time. The sound of another vehicle approaching caused both officers to pause momentarily. Their quick exchange of glances carried a weight that the teenagers couldn't yet understand, but would soon become clear to everyone involved. Whatever these officers had planned for this stop, the arrival of unexpected witnesses wasn't part of their script. In the distance, a car door slammed. The brother recognized the sound, their father's government vehicle. The officer's demeanor shifted subtly, but noticeably. Officer C's hand, which had been carelessly tossing aside their belongings, suddenly became still. Officer T's aggressive stance softened almost imperceptibly. They didn't know it yet, but their carefully orchestrated plan was about to unravel in ways none of them could have anticipated. The next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of corruption and change the face of local law enforcement forever. The search of the Mercedes SUV had turned from aggressive to almost frantic. Officer T yanked open the glove compartment, scattering registration papers and maintenance records across the passenger seat. His partner, Officer C, continued ransacking the trunk, treating the teenagers' volunteer materials like garbage. "What's in these envelopes?" Officer C demanded, holding up a stack of sealed white envelopes with the church's logo. The sister stepped forward instinctively but stopped when Officer T raised his hand in warning. "Those are donation checks for the homeless shelter," she explained, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Please be careful with them. People from the church trusted us to deliver those." Officer C snorted and began tearing open the envelopes one by one, letting the checks flutter to the ground in the growing evening breeze. Each envelope revealed exactly what the teens had said, charitable donations for the church's homeless shelter program. The officer's frustration became more visible with each opened envelope. A small crowd had gathered now, watching from behind the safety of their phone cameras. Mrs. P from next door had called other neighbors, and the whispers of disapproval grew louder with each passing moment. "Those officers aren't following protocol," one neighbor, a retired police sergeant, muttered loudly enough for others to hear. The brother watched helplessly as Officer T moved to the backseat, roughly pulling out their volunteer aprons and nandegs. The officer's body camera light blinked steadily, recording everything. A detail that would later prove crucial in the investigation. "What's this?" Officer T suddenly called out, holding up a small paper bag from the backseat floor. His tone suggested he'd found something significant, but the sister recognized it immediately. "That's my lunch bag from today," she said. "There's just an apple and some crackers inside." Her voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but from the heartbreak of watching these officers destroy their hard work from the food drive. Officer C abandoned the trunk and strode over, taking the bag with exaggerated care as if handling evidence. He opened it slowly, then cursed under his breath when he found exactly what the sister had described: a half-eaten apple and an unopened package of crackers. The officer's growing frustration was becoming more obvious. They had clearly expected to find something else, though what exactly that might be would only become clear later. Their search became more aggressive, more careless, as if they were running out of time. "Check under the seats again," Officer C ordered, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. There has to be something here. The tip was specific about this vehicle. The brother and sister exchanged glances. What tip? Who would have reported their father's car? The questions multiplied, but they knew better than to ask them aloud. Officer T reached under the driver's seat, his flashlight beam dancing wildly in the growing darkness. The sound of tearing fabric made the brother wince. They were actually damaging the car's interior now. A sudden gust of wind scattered some of the donation checks across the street. The sister took an instinctive step to retrieve them, but Officer C blocked her path. "Don't move," he ordered, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The retired police sergeant had moved closer, his phone held steady as he recorded. "You boys might want to check your body cameras," he called out, his experienced eye noting details that would later become evidence. "Make sure they're working properly." Both officers flinched slightly at his words, another telling detail that investigators would later note. Their search had yielded nothing but legitimate volunteer materials and personal belongings, yet they seemed unable to stop, as if compelled by some unseen pressure. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed down the quiet street, multiple cars by the sound of it. The officers exchanged another quick glance, this one tinged with something that looked almost like panic. Officer C still clutched the last few unopened donation envelopes, his knuckles white with tension. The teenager's phones bulged in his pocket, both now suspiciously silent, no incoming calls or messages showing on their screens. The brother stood a little straighter, recognizing the approaching engine sound. Their father's government car had a distinctive purr, and he could hear it getting closer. Whatever was about to happen next would change everything, though none of them could have predicted just how completely their lives were about to be transformed. The black government vehicle turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The senator's arrival was about to change everything. His car pulled up smoothly behind the police cruiser, lights off, engine purring to a stop. Officer T straightened up from where he'd been searching under the seats, while Officer C quickly stuffed the remaining unopened donation envelopes into his pocket alongside the teenager's phones. The scattered checks from the already opened envelopes continued dancing across the pavement in the evening breeze. The senator stepped out of his car with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms before entering politics. He was still wearing his weekend casual clothes, a simple polo shirt and slacks, but his presence commanded attention immediately. "Would someone like to explain why my children are standing on the curb?" His voice carried clearly across the scene, calm but filled with unmistakable authority. He walked forward slowly, hands visible at his sides, every movement measured and deliberate. Officer T stepped forward, attempting to take control of the situation. "Sir, this is an active investigation. We're going to need you to—" "I can see exactly what this is," The senator interrupted, his eyes taking in the scattered papers, the opened envelopes, and his children's worried faces. And I can also see at least 3 violations of department policy just from where I'm standing. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, their phones still recording. The retired police sergeant stepped forward, introducing himself to the senator with a quick handshake. "Been watching the whole thing, sir. Happy to provide my professional opinion on what I've witnessed." The senator nodded his thanks, then turned back to the officers. "My daughter's text mentioned you took their phones. I'd like those returned immediately." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Officer C shifted uncomfortably, the phones weighing heavy in his pocket. "Sir, these devices could contain evidence." "Evidence of what, exactly?" the senator asked, his voice taking on the sharp edge he usually reserved for congressional hearings. "Evidence of my children's volunteer work at their church? Evidence of the donation checks you've scattered across the street? Or perhaps evidence of something else you were hoping to find?" The significance of his last question wasn't lost on anyone present. The officers exchanged another quick glance, this one filled with barely concealed panic. Whatever they had planned for this traffic stop, it clearly hadn't involved dealing with a senator who was also a former civil rights attorney. "Dad," the sister called out softly, "they didn't log anything they searched. And they turned off my phone right after I texted you." The senator's expression hardened. He turned to the retired police sergeant. "Did you witness that?" "Yes, sir," the retired sergeant replied. "Got it all on video, including when they disabled the phones. Mighty unusual procedure, if you ask me." Officer T attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, we received an anonymous tip about this vehicle." "An anonymous tip?" the senator repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "About a vehicle registered to a United States senator? A vehicle with government plates?" He paused, letting the implication sink in. "I'd be very interested in hearing more about this supposed tip. Perhaps we should discuss it downtown with your supervisor present." The color drained from Officer C's face. His hand unconsciously moved to his pocket, where the phones and remaining envelopes seemed to burn against his uniform. More vehicles were approaching now, these with flashing lights. Someone in the crowd had called the police department directly, reporting possible officer misconduct. The cavalry was arriving, but it wasn't clear yet which side they would support. The senator turned to his children. "Are you both okay?" When they nodded, he continued, "I want you to write down everything you remember about what happened here. Every detail." He turned back to the officers, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. "Because I have a feeling this evening is going to result in quite a few interesting conversations." The neighbors had moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around the scene. Mrs. P was carefully collecting the scattered donation checks, documenting each one with her phone camera before placing it in her garden apron. The approaching police sirens grew louder, their lights now visible at the end of the street. Officer T and Officer C stood frozen, their carefully laid plans crumbling around them. They didn't know it yet, but their actions tonight would expose a corruption scheme that went far beyond a simple traffic stop gone wrong. The senator placed a protective hand on each of his children's shoulders, his calm demeanor masking the anger burning beneath. "I think," he said quietly, "we're about to discover exactly why you were so interested in searching this particular vehicle tonight." The Internal Affairs Investigation Room buzzed with tension 3 days after the roadside incident. The wall-mounted screens displayed footage from both officers' body cameras, while another monitor showed videos taken by the neighbors. The contrast between the official and civilian recordings would prove crucial. "Play that segment again," the lead investigator requested, leaning forward in his chair. The footage showed Officer C turning off the teenager's phone, an action that wasn't visible in the body camera footage due to a conveniently blocked camera angle. The investigation had started as a routine response to a complaint about officer misconduct. But as the team dug deeper, disturbing patterns began emerging. The lead investigator spread 6 case files across the conference table, each containing similar complaints from the past 3 months. All luxury vehicles, his partner noted, scanning through the reports. All belonging to families with influence or money. All stopped based on anonymous tips. She put air quotes around the last words, her expression grim. The retired police sergeant who had witnessed the incident sat with them, providing his expert perspective. "In my 30 years on the force, "I've never seen anonymous tips targeting specific vehicles with this level of detail," he explained, pointing to the dispatch logs. The investigation team had pulled the officers' phone records. What they found was disturbing. Text messages deleted but recovered through forensics, revealing conversations with unknown numbers discussing target vehicles and collection opportunities. "Look at this pattern," the lead investigator said, pulling up a map on the main screen. Red dots mark the locations of similar stops across the city. They clustered around affluent neighborhoods, each stop following an identical protocol. Aggressive search, phone confiscation, and surprising levels of specific information about the targets. The teenagers' phones, finally recovered and analyzed, provided another crucial piece of evidence. The sisters' final text to their father had never been delivered. Officer C had turned off the phone specifically to prevent it. This level of premeditation suggested something far more sinister than random harassment. A junior investigator burst into the room, clutching a stack of freshly printed documents. "You need to see this," he said breathlessly. "We pulled Officer T's bank records. Small deposits, different amounts, all from untraceable accounts. But here's the interesting part. They correspond perfectly with the dates of these traffic stops." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about two officers abusing their power. This was organized, systematic, and carefully planned. The senator's kids, the lead investigator mused, they weren't just random targets. Their father's position made them valuable, but something went wrong with the plan. The retired sergeant nodded. They didn't expect the father to arrive so quickly. These other cases, he gestured to the files, the parents always arrived much later, after the officers had more time to find something in the vehicles. The wall of evidence grew larger by the hour. Financial records, text messages, body camera footage that conveniently cut out at crucial moments, all pointing to a sophisticated scheme. But the biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young detective who had been analyzing traffic patterns noticed something odd. Each targeted vehicle had been photographed earlier the same day, usually near expensive schools or upscale shopping areas. Someone was selecting targets deliberately, providing the officers with specific information about when and where to find these vehicles. "Pull up the parking garage footage," the lead investigator ordered. The team watched as a familiar figure appeared on screen. Officer T, off-duty, photographing luxury vehicles in the mall parking garage. The timestamp showed this happening just hours before several of the suspicious stops. The investigation team worked through the night, fueled by coffee and the growing realization that they had uncovered something much bigger than expected. The senator's children hadn't just been victims of random police harassment, they had inadvertently exposed a criminal enterprise operating within the department. As dawn broke, the lead investigator stood before the evidence wall, connecting more dots. The anonymous tips had come from burner phones, all purchased from the same convenience store. Traffic camera footage showed Officer C visiting that store regularly, always paying cash. "We're not just looking at corruption," he announced to his tired team. "This is organized crime wearing a badge. And thanks to one senator's quick arrival and some observant neighbors, we've got them dead to rights." The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear. What had started as a wrongful search of two teenagers was about to expose a scandal that would shake the entire police department to its core. The question now wasn't if there would be arrests, but how high up the chain of command this corruption reached. The truth exploded like a bombshell 1 week after the roadside incident. The police chief stood before a packed press conference room, his face grave as he prepared to reveal findings that would forever change the department. Behind him, a screen displayed evidence photos, text messages, and financial records that told a story almost too shocking to believe. "What began as an investigation into a single traffic stop," the chief began, "has uncovered a criminal enterprise operating within our own ranks." The room fell silent, reporters leaning forward in their chairs, cameras flashing. The scheme was both simple and devastating in its execution. A group of corrupt officers had partnered with a local crime syndicate to target wealthy families' children. The plan: create false evidence during traffic stops, then use the threat of arrest to extort money from panicked parents. Digital forensics had recovered thousands of text messages between the officers and their criminal partners. The messages revealed a carefully orchestrated system. Spotters would photograph luxury vehicles driven by young people, particularly near private schools and upscale areas. They'd note license plates, routes, and regular schedules. These officers, the chief continued, holding up a stack of documents, would then receive detailed information about their targets. They knew exactly when and where to find specific vehicles. They knew which families had the most to lose from a scandal. The brother and sister's stop had gone wrong for one simple reason: their father's immediate arrival had interrupted the officers before they could plant evidence in the vehicle. The investigation revealed a hidden compartment in Officer T's cruiser containing small bags of planted evidence ready to be discovered during searches. The recovered text messages painted a disturbing picture. "Rich kids equals easy money," one officer had written. "Parents will pay anything to keep their precious babies out of jail." The cynicism in their communications was chilling. The retired police sergeant who had witnessed the original incident sat in the front row, nodding grimly as the chief detailed how the scheme worked. The officers would find planted evidence, then offer terrified parents a choice: pay a substantial handling fee to make the problem disappear, or watch their children face serious charges. Most parents paid, the chief explained, his voice heavy with disgust. They paid to protect their children from false charges, never realizing they were victims of an elaborate extortion scheme. The investigation had uncovered offshore accounts, burner phones, and a network of collaborators that stretched from street-level criminals to supposedly respectable businesspeople. The team had found detailed records of payments, carefully disguised as consulting fees or business transactions. But the most damning evidence came from the officers' own body cameras. While they often claimed camera malfunctions during crucial moments, the investigation team had recovered deleted footage showing officers discussing their plans, planting evidence, and even laughing about their victims' fear. The stop of the senator's children, the chief continued, was meant to be their biggest payday yet. He clicked to the next slide, showing a text message recovered from Officer C's phone. "Senator's kids equals golden ticket. Make it happen tonight." The room buzzed with shocked murmurs as the chief revealed how the scheme had begun to unravel. The quick thinking of the sister in texting her father, the vigilant neighbors recording everything, and the retired surgeon's professional observations had combined to derail what was supposed to be a routine frame-up. These officers didn't count on facing someone who couldn't be intimidated, the chief explained. They didn't expect a father who knew the law better than they did. And they certainly didn't expect their routine traffic stop to trigger an investigation that would expose years of corruption. The evidence wall behind the chief told the story in devastating detail. Photographs of targeted vehicles, lists of wealthy families, records of payoffs, and the scripts officers used to frighten parents into paying. Each piece had been carefully documented, creating an airtight case against everyone involved. As questions poured in from reporters, the chief held up his hand. "This investigation is ongoing," he announced. "But I can tell you this: what these officers did wasn't just criminal. It was a betrayal of everything the badge stands for. And thanks to two brave teenagers who stood their ground, a concerned community that got involved, and a father who arrived at exactly the right moment, this betrayal will never happen again." The revelation shocked the city, but it also sparked a wave of reform. Other parents began coming forward, sharing similar stories of mysterious traffic stops and threats that had disappeared after large payments. The web of corruption was vast, but it had finally been exposed to the light of day. The sun was setting on what seemed like just another ordinary evening on Oak Street. Two police officers were doing their usual patrol when they spotted a black SUV with a broken taillight. Officer Lee, a veteran with 15 years on the force, switched on the patrol car's lights. His partner, Officer Wilson, a recent academy graduate, readied herself for what they thought would be a routine traffic stop. The SUV pulled over smoothly into a well-lit area near a shopping center. Inside were three teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, all wearing private school uniforms. The officers noticed their nervous glances and whispered conversations, which immediately raised red flags in Officer Lee's mind. "Good evening," Officer Lee said, approaching the driver's window. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" The driver, a well-spoken teenager around 17, replied politely but with a slight tremor in his voice. "No, sir, I don't." "Your taillight is out. License and registration, please." As the teen reached for the glove compartment, Officer Lee noticed his shaking hands. The boy's nervousness seemed excessive for a simple traffic stop. Meanwhile, Officer Wilson stood at the passenger side, watching the other teens, who kept exchanging worried looks. "My dad's going to be so mad," one of the passengers muttered, reaching for his phone. "Put the phone down," Officer Lee commanded sharply. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The situation quickly escalated when Officer Lee claimed he smelled something suspicious. Despite the teens' protests that they were Senator Harrison's children, the officers decided to conduct a search. They made the teenagers step out of the vehicle, standing in the chilly evening air while Officer Wilson began examining the SUV. What the officers didn't realize was that several passers-by had started recording the scene on their phones. The teens remained surprisingly composed, with the oldest one calmly but firmly stating they didn't consent to the search and requesting to call their parents. "Look," the girl said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear, "our father is Senator Harrison. You can verify this. We're just trying to get home from debate club." Officer Lee dismissed this as another excuse he'd heard countless times before. "If I had $1 for every time someone claimed to be related to someone important." 20 minutes into this increasingly tense situation, the quiet evening erupted into chaos. 3 black government vehicles appeared seemingly out of nowhere, tires screeching as they surrounded the scene. Men in dark suits emerged, followed by a distinguished-looking man in a tailored business suit and a woman in legal attire. The color drained from Officer Lee's face as he recognized Senator Harrison, one of the state's most prominent politicians, and his wife, a renowned civil rights attorney. The teen's story had been true all along. "What is the meaning of this?" Senator Harrison's voice cut through the night air like a knife. His wife, phone already in hand, was recording everything while simultaneously calling the police chief. Within hours, the incident exploded across social media. Body camera footage revealed the officers had conducted the search without probable cause, violating department procedures and constitutional rights. The police department faced intense public scrutiny as news channels picked up the story. But what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of filing lawsuits or demanding the officers' badges, the Harrison family took a different approach. Mrs. Harrison, drawing from her experience as a civil rights attorney, saw an opportunity for meaningful change. Working with police leadership and community organizations, the Harrisons helped establish a groundbreaking training program. The focus wasn't just on what the officers did wrong, but on how to do things right. They brought in experts to teach about implicit bias, constitutional rights, and the importance of de-escalation. Officer Wilson became an unexpected ally in the reform process. She spoke candidly about how the incident opened her eyes to her own biases and the importance of treating every citizen with respect. Her testimony helped shape new department policies and training procedures. Officer Lee, initially resistant to change, went through mandatory retraining. The experience forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his approach to policing. While he initially faced suspension, his willingness to learn and improve eventually earned him a role in helping train other officers about what not to do. The incident became a turning point for the department. New policies required officers to clearly explain their reasons for searches and obtain proper consent or probable cause. Body camera footage became a regular part of training sessions, helping officers learn from real-world situations. The Harrison teens also played a crucial role in the changes. They spoke at police academy sessions, sharing their perspective on how it felt to be wrongly suspected and searched. Their story helped humanize the impact of biased policing for new recruits. Local schools invited officers to speak with students about their rights and responsibilities during police encounters. These sessions helped build trust between law enforcement and young people, creating dialogue instead of division. A year later, the department's statistics showed a significant drop in complaint cases involving vehicle searches. The training program became a model for other police departments across the state. What started as a potentially tragic encounter transformed into a catalyst for positive change. The story served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the best response to injustice isn't punishment, but education and reform. By choosing collaboration over confrontation, the Harrison family helped create lasting change that benefited their entire community. As Mrs. Harrison often said in her speeches about the incident, change doesn't always come from tearing things down. Sometimes it comes from showing people a better way to build them up.